let's get into our next subject. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is going to be the introduction to a Music Theory 101 series. I've been doing a lot of videos on sound design. I did a Making Music 101. It's just kind of like a quick, rough and dirty introduction to making music. And I want to expand that to all of the other areas of making music. I want to do one on music theory. I want to do something on arrangement. I want to do things on more advanced topics as well. But I think this should be a great introduction for people who have either never tried to approach understanding music theory, or people who have some sort of a background in making music, but never went in and learned the theoretical applications of things. Because theory is, in general, just an abstraction of a practical concept. When we talk about music theory, what we're talking about is all of the stuff that we do when we write music, just kind of abstracted out to this concept, to this thing that we can apply some sort of special name to in order to communicate that idea more effectively to other people. This is true for almost every field. Like if I talk about an enzyme, when we're talking about things like biology, that is just a term meant to describe a particular biological process. If we're talking about programming and I talk about a function, in computer programming, a function is just another term for a repeatable sequence of code that you can use to execute a certain task. So when you are learning music, you can learn all of those concepts without having to internalize the lexicon or the dictionary of terms, just like you can learn what a function is by reading code and learning to code without necessarily knowing the name for it. You might call it a program, you might call it an app, you might call it an execution, but it's the same basic thing. With everything we go into for this video and for all the other videos we're going to do, I want you to look at this as a descriptive process, not a prescriptive one. I truly feel that one of the big failings in the music theory pedagogy, which is another technical term, a theoretical term, which is just talking about the way in which something is taught. I think that it has failed a lot of people by making them think that music theory is a set of rules, a set of instructions that you have to follow in order to make good music, when that's nowhere near what it's ever been. It's a way to catalog all of these discoveries in the musical history that has happened since the dawn of human civilization in order for us to exploit them or execute them in ways that we find appropriate. And if you can look at music as that, or music theory as that, as just a way to understand the history of music, a way to see how people who came before us did things, so that if we like that, we can apply it to our own music, we end up with, I believe, a much more fruitful discussion and a much less intimidating or much more approachable, much more accommodating form of theory. This is supposed to be part of a series on the basics, the fundamentals of music theory. We're going to be going over rhythm, then we're going to go on to melody, then we're going to go on to harmony, and then we're going to revisit rhythm in a more advanced way. And we're going to keep cycling through rhythm, melody, and harmony, going slightly more advanced each time. Let's talk about rhythm. We're going to go through the basics. We're going to go through some really redundant and probably boring information. But if you're someone who has no experience with music theory, this will be a great way to get started. So almost everything in music can be boiled down to this idea of repetition legitimizes. Almost everything going forwards with this conversation of music theory is that if you repeat something, the brain will, for some reason, technically it's because of this thing called apophenia, which we talked about in another video I did today, we start to categorize it into these patterns. So all I'm going to do here is place a musical note, and then I'm going to repeat it within this range right here. So your brain is already beginning to make categorizations here. Now, if I start doing this, our brain will keep that categorization. We can even go further. And further. And all along this pathway. Everybody put your hands up. Sorry. Anyways, all we're doing mentally at this moment is categorizing these into patterns. This is mostly due to our cultural background, but also just due to the fact that our brains are really good at counting time. So when you have a collection of pulses that can be equally timed, our brain starts to catalog them. At the biggest stage in this, we had a categorization of one beat every what we would call measure or bar. As we went further, we began to what we would call subdivide that bar or that measure into smaller, faster beats. So this is what we would call one bar. If we divide that in half and duplicate it, we would call that a half note. We do that again. We divide that larger whole beat or whole bar or whole note into 4. We get quarter notes. Then below that, we have 8 eighth notes, 16 16th notes, and 32 32nd notes. You can technically go further, and it just keeps doubling each time. You can have 64th notes, and 128th notes, and 256th notes, and 512, yeah. You get all these smaller and smaller subdivisions of the pulse. So now we have this categorization of notes that subdivide our whole bar or our whole note, right? That whole half, quarter, eighth, 16th. I'll leave it at that for now because most things are going to exist within this realm. You generally don't go below 16th notes. You can, but it's not really common, especially as a beginner. We can also look at this in terms of how many pulses there are in a whole measure. Again, this is part of the reason why I'm trying to keep measure and whole notes separate. Because we count these notes based on their division of a whole note, but you don't have to have this many quarter notes in a bar, or even this many eighth notes in a bar. For example, if I go over here, I'm going to go insert something called a time signature change. I'm going to put this to 3, 4. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean when we have a section in 3, 4 as opposed to where we started off? Well, if you notice, there's 4 quarter notes to 1 whole note. But if I take this, I have 1 whole bar. I could then subdivide that into no longer necessarily these 2 half notes. Doesn't quite work that same way. But if we shrink this down to the length of a quarter note, we can see that there are 3 quarter notes to take up the length of a full bar. And if I change this from 3/4 to, say, 6/8, we can see that a full bar could be seen as, if we're using 1/8 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are the 3 most common meters. Meter being the way we count the pulse of a whole bar. If you are trying to understand the pulse of a specific meter, we have to look at these 2 numbers kind of like a fraction, because it is a fractional representation, but the numerator and the denominator refer to 2 completely different things. Let's zoom in here for a second and let's talk about meters. The foundation of everything is going to be in a 4/4 pulse. It is the most common way that we end up seeing the formation of a bar. So much so that it is actually considered common time. So sometimes you will see on sheet music C instead of a numerator and a denominator. These are equal. These are the same exact things. This note, or this number, I should say, refers to the number of pulses. There are 4 pulses to equal 1 bar. The denominator is the length of each pulse, defined in those divisions we mentioned before: quarter notes, half notes, 1/8 notes, 16th notes, 32nd notes, etc. So 4/4 implies that you have 4 quarter notes for 1 whole note, 1 measure. If we say 6/8, we're saying there are 6 pulses going at an 1/8 note. Every 6/8 notes would equal 1 bar. Now, if you're paying attention, you might notice these 2 look like they're about the same length. If I take this and I pull this down here and make these quarter notes, for some reason, 6/8 and 3/4 have the same duration for a whole note. So how come we don't have them as the same exact thing? If we're doing some math, if we were trying to simplify fractions, 6/8 can be simplified to 3/4 just by dividing both of these by 2. That's pretty easy. But there's a really good reason why we don't do that. It depends on how you subdivide the pulse. Now, if we go to 4/4 and we just look really narrowly at 4/4, 4 quarter notes in a bar, how would we collect these beats together? Well, the very first one you hear, that's the strong beat. In fact, it's so strong, we call the first beat of a bar the down beat. Down, down, down. All of these are separate. We would call these either off beats or up beats, depending upon where you are and what their purpose is. You could also call them weak beats. Now, in 4/4, you generally have 2 strong beats and 2 weak beats. The first beat and the third beat are going to be our strong beats. mark these with an S. These two, which I'll color blue, are going to be our weak beats. Label them W. So now strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak. But this second strong beat doesn't have the same power, the same weight as this first strong beat. Again, that's why this is the down beat. I'll call this SD. And then I'll call this SU for the down beat and the up beat. Down. We start here. Never mind. Down, up, down, up, down, up. And as you go through these, you'll notice that things start to change. So let's take this and put this right here. We actually no longer have this secondary strong beat. We only have these weak beats. So now we have down, 2, 3, strong, 2, 3, strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, weak, ba, 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 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's going to be pretty consistent for most other pulses that you're going to feel it in the number, with one exception. If I move this over to 6/8 and then I do this, you notice we actually get back our strong and our weak strong beats. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Compare that with this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Because there's more in here, and just because of convention, we tend to feel 6/8 as 2. That's a part of the reason why we're not dividing by 2, because this is a pulse of 2 beats. This is a pulse of 3 beats, even though it's the same length. Now, you can have any number you want in the numerator of a bar. You can have any number you want here. For example, if I have 5, 4, this is saying that there are 5 quarter notes for 1 bar. So how would you subdivide that? 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, that can work, but there are generally seen to be problems with having to count numbers larger than 4. So, like we can take this 3, divide it into 3 pulses, take this 6 and divide it into 2 pulses, we could take this 5 and divide it into 2 pulses. Either a pulse of 3 and a pulse of 2, or a pulse of 2 and a pulse of 3, just like that. Now, this is way, way, way more advanced than what we're going to talk about today, so don't worry about this. But this is that compound meter that OTV is talking about. We have 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And most other meters are going to fit into this kind of realm. There are a few notable exceptions. One is going to be the meter of 2/2, also known as cut time. It looks kind of like this. You have a C with a line through it. This is the same as saying 2/2. It is rhythmically the same as 4/4, but generally it's felt as faster because the pulses, technically speaking, come more frequently. Now, with all of that in mind, let's ignore these time signature changes and let's just go back to 4/4. Because in all of these, we're dividing the same length of a pulse or a single beat. So all of this is done at a specific tempo right up here. So if I turn on the metronome, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice how the downbeat has a higher pitched note. Do, 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 do. That is a good way of feeling sort of these pulses. As I change this number, it changes how long it takes for these pulses to repeat, so to speak, how long it takes for us to get back to that first downbeat. This is saying that for every beat, which means this first number, for every one of these numbers, there are going to be, if we timed this out for a minute, right? If I had this go all the way to 1 minute, there we go. There are 120 kick drums right here. If you went in, and I encourage you to do that, if you go in and count up every single one of these kick drums, all 120 of them, you will see that these numbers match pretty identically. If I change this to, say, 150, and I try and find the same distance, you can see there's actually a whole lot more I have to add in. I'd have to add in, essentially, 30 more. 30 more of these pulses. Let's even count. 2, 4, 10, that's 10, 20, 30. Exactly. 30 more pulses exactly in 4/4 to reach 150 BPM. Now, if I switch this to, say, 3/4, what do you think is going to happen? You feel this? Do you think it's going to get faster or slower? I want chat to give me a guess. Do y'all think that it's going to get faster or slower when I go from 4 pulses in 120 or 120 pulses in groupings of 4 per minute, 120 pulses in a grouping of 3 per minute? Slower? Anyone think faster? Slower? Okay, so everyone thinks it's going to be slower. But here's 4/4. Here's 3/4. It's technically faster because you're resetting the pulse more frequently. You're resetting that downbeat. Remember, with no metronome, there's no difference because you're not emphasizing the pulses. But when we're emphasizing the downbeat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, versus 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So generally, the lower the numerator, the faster the pulse. Now, let's go the opposite direction. Let's say I want to go from 4/4 to 4/2. I'm going to make the length of the pulse with the metronome on. Is this going to feel faster or slower when you have 4/2 versus 4/4? So this is 4/4. This is 4/2. It is twice as long. I'm going to count out, well, I guess I'm not. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to have this percussion right here play 4/2, so you can kind of feel the difference. So another way to think about it is it takes half as many pulses to take the same amount of time. So it takes longer for the same number of pulses, because you have to have twice the pulses to get to the same number. So we have kind of this split counting, right? As you reduce the number of pulses per bar, the tempo gets faster, even if the actual tempo is numerically the same. Reducing the number of pulses makes it faster. Increasing the number of pulses makes it slower. Reducing the numerator, or the denominator, which is to say increasing the size of the pulse, makes it longer. Decreasing the size of the pulse, making the number larger, makes it faster. Because again, 4 quarter notes is going to take more time than 4 16th notes. In fact, it takes 1/4 as much time to play a 16th note as it is to play a quarter note, because there are 4 16th notes in a quarter note. Now, the last thing I want to really talk about here, and the thing that I think will hopefully start to tie all of this together, is going to be the circularity of these rhythms. Now, what we have right here at 4/4 is 2 ways of interpreting this pulse. Up here, we have just every note played. 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can kind of count that off. When I add this in with the metronome, let's see how that feels. You still feel that pulse, like that. But if we take that away, 3, 4, 1, right? Your brain categorizes that as a faster tempo. It's like SW is saying, it's almost like you're writing in 4/2. You are writing at half the time of your original pulse. You could look at this as half time. And conversely, if in the same region I have twice as many notes, without that metronome, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? It's almost like we have doubled the number of beats, which we have, or doubled the time in which we're playing the beat. So this is called double time. Now, every tempo has both a double time version and a half time version. If I go back to my kick drum, if I set this to 240, same exact thing as doing this. Sounds identical, right? If I set this to 60, sounds exactly the same as if I'm at 120 and we do this. So throughout all of the different styles of music, you can start to organize your beats, not just in terms of the pulse you're feeling each hit at, but what other subdivisions, whether faster or slower, you can apply to your music. And the last thing I'll say, the very last thing that's kind of connected with this, and it'll help us lead into, in 3 weeks, the next Rhythm 101. What happens if we take these 4 pulses and we try to fit the length of a 3/4 pulse in there? What does that sound like? Ooh, what's that? 1, 2, 3. It's just the same thing if I go ahead and I set like a time signature marker right here for 3, 4. It totally fits. This off here. These. It's a little bit faster because of the tempo thing, but if I got these tempos right, you can technically subdivide every rhythm, not just into these smaller pulses like that, but into different meters. The two most common ways of doing this are what we would call triplet meter, where you have 3 pulses in the space of 4 beats like this. Where you can hear like 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Repeating the same amount. And the other thing would be what we call a duple, which is where you take a pulse and you divide it into 2 equal regions. So now we have this pulse of 3 up here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But we could, in the same region, do what we call a duple and fit 2 beats into that same pulse. You can go over 3 or 4 or 5. Like you can do things like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, and you can go way far beyond that. But really, I'm just trying to introduce you to kind of the interconnectedness of meter and tempo. These are the same idea, almost like 2 sides of a coin. On one side is you have the length of an individual pulse. How many pulses do you have in a single minute of time? That is a big foray into this world of music theory, this way of describing different qualities of the music that we write and how they can be applied into your own music. Next week, for the Music Theory 101, we're going to be introducing the very bare bones basic fundamentals of melody. We're going to be talking about scales, and we're going to be talking about keys. We're only going to be talking about major and minor. I'm going to do it a little bit differently, though. I'm going to do a different thing. I want to see if this works. So if you're interested in seeing my approach to teaching keys, you are more than welcome to come along for the ride. But that'll be next week. The week after, we are going to be doing the first foray into harmony. And then the week after that, we're going to circle back around towards rhythm. We're going to be talking about syncopation. We're going to talk about swing. And we're going to talk about the beginnings of polyrhythms. But that's going to be more for a few weeks down the road. If you are watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Do all that fun YouTube stuff. Click the little bell icon. Tell me what you find most interesting about rhythm theory and what topics you think I should be covering in a Music Theory 101 on rhythm. Check out my Twitch. That's where we do these streams every Thursday for Theory Thursday. Check out my Patreon. I'm going to be uploading YouTube videos early to my Patreon. Patreons also get a discount on lessons. If you want to get private lessons with me, you can either DM me on Discord or send me an email or DM me on Twitter or fill out the form on my website. And patrons get a minor discount for basically donating money to me every month. Thank you all so much. And I guess this will be where we cut the video.